The first sign that something was wrong was not the dead crops. It was the silence. For 80 years, the Bennett farm had started every morning the same way. The sound of water moving through the fields. The sound of tractors warming up before sunrise. The sound of another season beginning. But on a cold morning in June, the fields were quiet. Elena Bennett knew something was wrong before she even reached the northern field. Farmers develop a connection with their land that is difficult to explain. They notice when the soil feels different. They notice when crops grow differently. They notice when something that has worked for generations suddenly stops working. And that morning, the Bennett farm stopped breathing. To outsiders, the Bennett farm was just another piece of farmland in rural America. A few hundred acres surrounded by thousands of others. But to Elena, it was home. This was where her father taught her that farming was not about fighting nature. It was about understanding it. Every fence post had a story. Every field carried a memory. Every harvest represented another year the family had kept their promise to the land. At 28 years old, Elena Bennett had already learned something many people never understand. A farm is not simply inherited. It is earned again every single day. While others saw land as an investment, Elena saw responsibility. And that responsibility was about to be tested. At first, Elena thought it was a mechanical failure. Maybe a broken pump. Maybe an old pipe finally gave out. But then she noticed something that changed everything. The damage was too precise. Too deliberate. Someone had not forgotten to maintain the water system. Someone had made sure the water would never reach her fields again. And Elena soon discovered something even more troubling. Her farm was not the only one affected. Across the valley, other farmers were facing the same nightmare. The water source that had supported generations of families was suddenly gone. And when water disappears from a farming community, everything else begins disappearing with it. Elena expected a fight. She expected lawyers. She expected someone with a corporate logo and a team of people who had never touched the soil they were trying to control. But what she found was something far more complicated. The person standing between her farm and its water supply was not a stranger. It was someone who understood farming. Daniel Mercer had spent his entire life farming. He knew what drought felt like. He knew what losing a harvest meant. He knew the pressure that kept farmers awake at night. Which was why Elena couldn't understand one thing. Why would another farmer buy the water rights that her family depended on?
You knew what this water meant to us. Your family has farmed this land just like mine.
That's exactly why I did it.
Because Daniel Mercer was not trying to destroy Elena's farm. He was trying to save his own. For a moment, Elena said nothing. Because the man standing across from her wasn't a villain. He was a mirror. If you've ever found out that the person hurting you was only doing what you would have done in their place, hit like right now. Because what Elena does next won't just decide who gets the water. It will decide what kind of farmer she becomes. Subscribe to find out which one she chooses to be. Years earlier, Daniel's farm had been hit by the same problem facing farmers across America. Water shortages. Rising costs. A system that was slowly failing everyone. He believed the only way to survive was to control the water before someone else did. But Elena saw something Daniel did not. The problem was never that there wasn't enough water. The problem was that farmers were still depending on a system designed generations ago. And if Elena could prove she was right, she wouldn't just save her farm. She could change farming across the entire valley. 7 days without water can change everything on a farm. 7 days is the difference between a successful season and a financial disaster. For Elena Bennett, every morning brought a new reminder that the farm she inherited was running out of time. The fields were still there. The barns were still standing. The equipment still worked. But the thing that gave everything life was missing. Water. Farmers often talk about weather being unpredictable. But Elena discovered something even harder to survive. Uncertainty. Every day without water meant another decision. Do they plant fewer crops? Do they borrow more money? Do they risk everything and hope for rain? Because farming is not only a battle against nature. It is also a battle against time. As the weeks passed, the water problem created something nobody expected. Division. Some farmers believed they had to protect what little water remained. Others believed everyone needed to share what was left. And slowly, neighbors who had worked together for decades began looking at each other differently. Elena needed answers. And the person who had them was the last person she expected. Daniel Mercer. The man who had purchased the water rights. Daniel Mercer was not trying to hurt Elena. He was trying to avoid becoming another farmer forced to sell everything. Years earlier, Daniel watched his own fields fail.
Yes.
Not because he stopped caring. Not because he stopped working. But because the old way of farming could no longer survive the new challenges. Standing beside the empty water channel, Elena realized something important. Everyone was asking the same question. Who gets the water? But nobody was asking the question that mattered. Why were farmers still depending on a system that wasted so much of it? Maybe the problem was not that America had too little water. Maybe the problem was that farms were designed for a different century. That night, Elena did something nobody expected. She stopped trying to restore the old system and started designing a new one. A system that used less water. A system that rebuilt the soil. A system that could help farmers survive even when nature refused to cooperate. But there was one problem. Nobody believed it would work. The strangest ideas in history usually begin the same way. Someone sees a problem everyone has accepted and refuses to believe it has to stay that way. That was exactly what Elena Bennett was doing. She was not trying to find a new water source. She was trying to create a farm that needed less water to survive. And to most people, that sounded impossible. When Elena called the community meeting, many farmers expected one thing. A solution. Instead, they heard a question. Elena said, "What if the future of farming isn't about finding more water? What if it's about learning how to keep the water we already have?" Nobody answered. Because sometimes the hardest ideas to accept are not the complicated ones. They are the ones that challenge everything people have spent their lives believing. Then Daniel Mercer stood up. The man who controlled the water supply. The man many farmers blamed. The man who had already tried the traditional solution.
I've spent 30 years trying to solve this problem. You think a few ideas what nature has been telling us for decades?
No. I think the way we've always done things has stopped working.
But Elena knew something important. An idea alone was not enough. Farming is built on proof. And she needed someone who understood both worlds. The wisdom of the old farmer. And the science of the future. That person was Richard Whitmore.
Your father showed me this farm 20 years ago. He told me the next generation would have to solve problems his generation never faced.
The system Elena imagined had 3 parts. First, capture every drop before it disappeared. Second, teach the soil to hold more water naturally. Third, grow crops in a way that worked with nature instead of constantly fighting against it. To Elena, it was a farming system. To everyone else, it sounded like a science experiment. Elena did not ask the community to believe her. She knew belief was earned. So she made a decision. She would test everything on 1 acre. 1 acre would decide whether her idea was brilliant, or whether she had just risked the future of her family farm on a dream. And then, something happened that nobody expected. The first test failed. The soil was not ready. The system was not perfect. The numbers did not match Elena's predictions. For the first time, Even Elena wondered if everyone else had been right.
You know what most innovators do wrong?
What?
They think failure means the idea was wrong. Sometimes failure just means the idea is incomplete.
And that was the moment Elena realized something. She wasn't trying to build a better irrigation system. She was trying to teach the farm a completely different way to survive. But before she could prove that, she would have to convince the one group of people who mattered most. The farmers who had already seen everything fail. For 3 weeks, Elena Bennett watched her experiment struggle. The plants were alive, but they were not thriving. The water savings were impressive. The technology worked. The numbers looked promising. But something was missing. The land was still behaving like a farm waiting for water. And Elena needed it to become something different. Most farmers looked at dry soil and saw a problem. Elena started looking at it differently. What if the soil was not failing? What if the soil was responding? What if decades of farming had taught the land to depend on something it could no longer receive? Water. Richard explained something that changed the way Elena saw her farm. Soil was not just dirt. It was a living system. A hidden world beneath every farmer's feet. A world filled with organisms, air pockets, nutrients, and biological activity that determined how much water the ground could hold. The problem was not simply that the farm needed more water. The problem was that the soil had lost its ability to keep the water it received. Elena changed her strategy. Instead of asking, "How do we bring more water to the farm?" she asked, "How do we make every drop work harder?" The new system combined 3 ideas: precision technology, regenerative soil management, and smarter crop planning. It was not a return to the past. It was a redesign of the future. But the hardest part was not changing the soil. It was changing people's minds. Farmers are not against change. They are against change that has never been tested. And Elena understood that. Then, after weeks of testing, the numbers changed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But enough. The soil was beginning to hold moisture longer. The plants were developing deeper roots. And the experimental acre was showing something nobody expected. The farm was learning to survive with less water. The secret beneath the soil was never a hidden invention. It was a truth that had been there the entire time. A farm's greatest resource was not always what came from above. Sometimes, it was what was happening below. And for the first time since the water disappeared, Elena Bennett believed she might actually have a way forward. But proving it on 1 acre was one thing. Convincing an entire farming community was something else entirely. For weeks, the Bennett farm had become a place where people came to see something fail. Neighbors drove past expecting to see another experiment collapse. Farmers stopped by expecting Elena Bennett to finally admit what they already believed. That farming could not be changed by one person with an idea. But then something happened that nobody planned for. People started slowing down. Not because Elena asked them to. Because the field itself was giving them a reason to look. The difference was impossible to ignore. The surrounding fields were fighting the drought. Elena's field was adapting to it. The system she created was not designed to replace farmers. It was designed to help farmers work smarter with what they already had. Every drop of water was measured. Every section of soil was monitored. Every crop was planted according to what the land could realistically support. It was not about forcing the farm to produce more. It was about teaching the farm to waste less. Elena's system was built on 3 principles. First, measure what the farm actually needs. For generations, farmers often had to make decisions based on experience and prediction. Elena added another tool: data. The soil could now communicate. Second, protect every drop. Instead of flooding fields and hoping enough water reached the roots, The system delivered water exactly where it mattered. Third, build stronger soil. Because Elena discovered something important. The strongest farms were not the ones with the most water. They were the ones that knew how to hold onto it. For Daniel Mercer, seeing the results created a problem. Because accepting Elena's success meant accepting something uncomfortable. He had spent years believing the only way to survive was to control more resources. But Elena had proven something different. Survival came from using resources differently.
I spent 10 years trying to find more water. You spent 10 weeks figuring out how not to lose it.
The water was never the only problem. We just thought it was.
The first person to change was not Daniel. It was someone nobody expected. Tom Hayes had farmed the same way for 40 years. He trusted experience. He trusted tradition. And he trusted what had always worked. But he also understood something every farmer understands. If something stops working, you either adapt or you disappear. Slowly, the conversation changed. The question was no longer, will Elena's idea work? The question became, how many farms could this help? But success creates a new kind of pressure. Because once people start paying attention, they also start asking questions. Not everyone was convinced. Some farmers questioned whether Elena's methods could work beyond one small field. Others wondered if technology was making farming too complicated. And some asked the most difficult question. What happens when the system fails? Because proving something works in perfect conditions is easy. The real test comes when nature fights back. The hardest moment for any farmer is not planting. It is waiting. Waiting to discover whether every decision made months earlier was the right one. And after everything, Elena had changed. The day of the harvest finally arrived. The community expected one of two things. Either Elena Bennett had discovered something that could change farming, or she had spent an entire season proving nothing. There was no middle ground. Daniel Mercer had seen thousands of harvests in his lifetime. He knew what healthy crops looked like. He knew what struggling crops looked like. And what he saw in Elena's field created a problem he could not ignore. The field was producing, not because Elena had found more water, but because she had changed how the farm used the water it already had. But success brought a new question. Could this work anywhere else? Because one successful field can be dismissed as luck. One successful farm can be called an exception. But a system has to prove itself beyond the person who created it. And now Elena faced the challenge she never expected. She had to convince farmers across the valley to try something they had spent their entire lives avoiding. Change. For years, Elena Bennett's farm was a place people passed without noticing. Just another family farm in a long line of American farms fighting to survive. But now, people were coming. Not because they wanted to buy the land. Not because they wanted to control the water. They came because they wanted an answer. How was a farm that lost its water-producing crops when farms with more resources were struggling? The first visitors came quietly. They did not want attention. They wanted proof. Because farmers understand something outsiders often miss. A good story can inspire you. But a good harvest is what convinces you. They examined everything. The soil. The roots. The water usage. The crop quality. And the more they looked, the harder it became to explain away. Richard Whitmore knew numbers mattered. Farmers could respect an idea. But they trusted results. The results were surprising. The Bennett farm had reduced water usage. The soil was improving. And the crops were showing stronger resilience. But there was one problem. The numbers created more questions than answers. Not everyone was ready to celebrate. Because every breakthrough has two groups of people. Those who see possibility. And those who see risk.
Elena, your farm is impressive. But farming isn't about one season. What happens 5 years from now? What happens when everyone tries this and it doesn't work?
It was a fair question. Because Elena was not trying to create a successful experiment. She was trying to create a system people could depend on. Then Daniel Mercer did something nobody expected. He stood up. The same man who had once believed controlling water was the only way to survive. Was about to say something that would change the entire conversation. Daniel said, "I spent years trying to protect my farm by holding on to what I had. Elena showed me something different. Sometimes survival isn't about protecting what belongs to you. Sometimes it's about finding a better way for everyone." For the first time, Daniel Mercer was not defending his decision. He was defending Elena's future. The next morning, Elena received a phone call. Then another. Farmers wanted her help. Not because they believed she had all the answers, but because she had proven something important. The future of farming did not belong only to those with the biggest farms. It belonged to those willing to learn. But Elena quickly realized something. Helping one farm was possible. Helping an entire farming region was something else. Every farm was different. Every soil type was different. Every farmer had different challenges. A system that worked on the Bennett farm had to prove it could adapt. Because the real question was never, can Elena save her farm? The real question was, can she change the way an entire generation thinks about farming? For the first time, the Bennett farm was no longer an experiment. It became a movement. But movements are fragile. Because the moment more people depend on an idea, the consequences of failure become much bigger. And Elena Bennett was about to discover something nobody warned her about. Creating change is difficult. But convincing people to trust that change is even harder. For months, everyone had been asking the same question. Who took the water? Who was responsible? Who caused the problem that nearly destroyed an entire farming community? But after everything Elena Bennett had learned, she realized they had been asking the wrong question. Because the biggest problem was not who controlled the water. The biggest problem was how long everyone had ignored what was happening to it. Richard suggested they do something nobody had considered. Stop looking at the farms. Start looking at the journey of the water itself. Because water does not disappear all at once. It disappears one mistake at a time. The valley's water system had been built for a different era. An era when water seemed endless. An era when farmers could afford waste because nature always seemed to provide more. But that era was gone. The results surprised everyone. The valley was not running out of water as quickly as people believed. The valley was losing water before it ever reached the fields. Decades of small losses had created a massive problem. Thousands of gallons disappearing, drop by drop. But Elena still had one question. Why did Daniel buy the water rights instead of working with everyone?
You knew this system was failing. Why didn't you tell everyone?
Because I tried. Years ago, I warned people. I said the system was breaking. Nobody wanted to hear it.
Daniel wasn't trying to control the water. He was trying to buy time. But fear can make people protect themselves instead of solving the problem together. Elena finally understood. The enemy was not another farmer. It was an outdated way of thinking. A belief that every farmer had to survive alone. A belief that one person's success required someone else's failure. But farming had always been connected. The soil connected them. The water connected them. The future connected them. Elena proposed something that sounded even more impossible than her first idea. A shared water intelligence system. Not one farm protecting its own resources. Not farmers competing for survival. But a network where farms could understand the needs of the entire valley. Water would no longer be something people fought over. It would become something they managed together. But there was one person whose support mattered most. Daniel Mercer. Because the man who once believed survival meant holding onto resources now had to decide whether he believed in sharing them. For the first time in years, farmers stopped looking across property lines and started looking at the valley as one living system. Elena Bennett had not simply created a farming method. She had created a new way for farmers to think. But there was still one final question. Could a system built on cooperation survive when money, politics, and old interests pushed back? Because changing farming was one thing. Changing an entire industry was something much bigger. For most of her life, Elena Bennett wanted one thing: a chance to keep her family's farm alive. She never wanted attention. She never wanted recognition. She never wanted to become the face of a movement. But there was something Elena learned about change. The moment people realize something works, they stop asking if it is possible. They start asking how they can be part of it. The visitors came from places Elena had never even heard of. Farmers facing the same problems. Higher costs. Less predictable resources. A future that seemed harder to understand every year. They did not come because Elena had discovered a miracle. They came because she had done something more valuable. She had proven that adaptation was possible. But Richard Whitmore knew the hardest challenge was still ahead. The Bennett farm was successful. The valley was improving. But could Elena's system survive somewhere completely different? Different soil. Different climate. Different farming traditions. A system is only revolutionary when it works beyond the person who created it. The first expansion did not go the way anyone expected. The technology worked. The science was correct. But the farmer using it struggled. And Elena discovered a problem nobody had considered. A farming system is not only built for the land. It must also be built for the people who work it. For years, Elena had focused on changing the farm. But now she understood something deeper. The farm was not the only thing that needed to adapt. The farmers did too. The future of agriculture would not be created by replacing experience with technology. It would be created by combining both. So Elena made a decision nobody expected. She stopped trying to convince farmers and started teaching them. The Bennett farm became more than a working farm. It became a place where old knowledge and new science could finally meet. Not because the past was perfect. And not because the future had all the answers. But because farming had always survived by learning. But success created a new problem. Elena's farming system had become impossible to ignore. And when an idea becomes valuable, people begin asking who owns it, who controls it, who profits from it, and whether something created to help farmers could accidentally become something farmers could no longer afford. For the first time since this journey began, Elena faced a problem that water could not solve: money. Because now people wanted to help her expand. But their help came with conditions. Conditions that could change the very reason she built the system in the first place. She had spent months proving that farmers did not have to depend on powerful people controlling their resources. Now she had to decide. Would she accept the help and reach millions of farmers? Or protect her vision and risk staying small? A year earlier, Elena Bennett was fighting to keep her farm alive. She was trying to stop the water from disappearing. She was trying to prove that a small family farm could survive in a changing world. But she never expected the hardest decision would come after she succeeded. Because saving something is one challenge. Deciding what happens to it afterward is another. Everyone saw the technology, the sensors, the data, the improved harvests. But they missed the most important part. Elena never created the system because she wanted to build something impressive. She built it because she remembered what it felt like to watch a way of life disappear. Richard understood the danger. The system could spread across the country. But if farmers lost control of it, then Elena would have solved one problem by creating another. Elena went to the one person who understood the mistake of holding on to something too tightly. Daniel Mercer.
I spent years believing control was the same thing as protection. I was wrong. The things that matter most don't survive because one person owns them. They survive because people believe they are worth protecting.
Those words stayed with Elena. The next morning, Elena made her decision. She rejected the idea of turning the system into something controlled by a few powerful organizations. Instead, she created something different. An open farming network. A system where farmers could learn, adapt, and improve together. The knowledge belonged to the people who needed it most. Years later, people would remember the Bennett farm differently. Not as the farm that lost its water. Not as the farm that almost disappeared. But as the place where people discovered something important. The future of farming was never about choosing between tradition and innovation. It was about having the courage to combine them. But when people asked Elena what her greatest achievement was, she never mentioned the technology. She never mentioned the awards. She never mentioned the attention. She always gave the same answer. I didn't save the farm. The farm saved itself. I just helped people listen. Because sometimes the greatest changes do not begin with someone having all the answers. They begin with someone brave enough to ask a different question. And that question changed everything. There are moments in history when people remember the invention. They remember the machine, the technology, the person who created it. But sometimes, the greatest changes are remembered differently. Not because of what was built, but because of what was restored. The Bennett farm was no longer remembered as the farm that almost disappeared. It became the farm that showed an entire generation what was possible. Every journey has a place where it began. For Elena Bennett, it was not a laboratory. It was not a conference room. It was one small acre of struggling land that most people had already given up on. That field taught her something she never forgot. A problem does not always need more resources. Sometimes it needs a better understanding. Daniel Mercer spent many years believing survival meant protecting what he had. But Elena changed the way he saw farming. He learned that the strongest farms were not built by people standing alone. They were built by communities willing to stand together. In the end, Daniel was remembered for something unexpected. Not for controlling the water, but for helping return it to the people. Richard Whitmore continued doing what he always believed in. Connecting knowledge with action. He often told his students something simple. Science doesn't replace farmers. It gives farmers more ways to protect what they already know. The Bennett system did not change farming overnight. Real change rarely happens that way. It happened one field at a time. One farmer at a time. One decision at a time. Because the biggest transformations in history are not created by one person standing above everyone else. They are created when one person inspires others to stand with them. When people asked Elena Bennett what she wanted people to remember, she never talked about being right. She never talked about proving people wrong. She talked about something much simpler. The land was never our enemy. We just stopped listening to it. The world will always change. The weather will change. The challenges will change. The problems waiting for the next generation will change. But the lesson from Elena Bennett's farm remains the same. The future does not belong to those who refuse to change. It belongs to those brave enough to imagine what could exist beyond what everyone else sees. Because beneath every field, beneath every community, beneath every impossible problem, there is always something waiting to grow. When people asked Elena Bennett what she wanted people to remember, she never talked about being right. She never talked about proving people wrong. She talked about something much simpler. The land was never our enemy. We just stopped listening to it. The world will always change. The weather will change. The challenges will change. The problems waiting for the next generation will change. But the lesson from Elena Bennett's farm remains the same. The future does not belong to those who refuse to change. It belongs to those brave enough to imagine what could exist beyond what everyone else sees. Because beneath every field, beneath every community, beneath every impossible problem, there is always something waiting to grow,